By the time nearly 3 full years had passed since that infamous morning at Pearl Harbor, the entire character of the war across the Pacific Ocean had undergone a transformation so complete that it would have seemed impossible to anyone observing the situation in those dark days of late 1941. The American forces, which had spent those early months desperately trying to hold what little ground they still possessed, had managed not only to halt the Japanese advance, but to reverse it entirely. Now they were the ones pushing forward, implementing their carefully calculated island-hopping approach that allowed them to bypass heavily fortified positions and instead strike at more vulnerable targets, each conquest bringing them incrementally closer to the shores of Japan itself. The operation to secure Saipan, located in the Mariana Islands chain, represented something far more significant than just another tactical victory in a long series of hard-fought battles. This particular island held strategic importance that both sides understood perfectly well. Should the island fall into American hands, the protective barrier that had shielded Japan's industrial heartland would be torn away, leaving the nation's major urban centers exposed for the first time to the devastating reach of the massive B-29 Superfortress bombers that the Americans had been developing specifically for such long-range strategic bombing missions. Confronted with this existential threat to their homeland, the strategists and admirals who made up the Japanese Imperial General Staff found themselves backed into a corner with no choice but to take an enormous risk. They would commit what remained of their once mighty naval fleet to a single decisive engagement, gambling everything on one throw of the dice. Admiral Toyota Somu, understanding the desperate nature of their situation, gave the order to initiate Operation Ego, a plan designed with the ambitious goal of recreating the kind of decisive fleet battle that had been the foundation of Japanese naval doctrine for decades, the concept they called Kantai Keson. The responsibility for executing this operation fell to Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, who assembled an impressive force by any measure, though one that paled in comparison to what the Imperial Navy had possessed earlier in the war. His fleet centered around 9 aircraft carriers that together could launch approximately 500 aircraft into combat. Supporting these carriers were 5 battleships, their massive guns ready to engage any surface threat, along with 13 cruisers providing additional firepower and more than 30 destroyers to screen the force and hunt enemy submarines. Beyond the aircraft that would fly from the carrier decks, Ozawa could also count on nearly 300 additional planes stationed at bases on the nearby islands, planes that could join the battle when needed. With this assembled strength, he hoped to shatter the American advance and turn the tide of the entire war. The American forces gathering to oppose this Japanese gamble operated under the overall command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose Fifth Fleet had become a byword for naval power in the Pacific. The actual carrier operations fell under the direction of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, whose Task Force 58 had evolved into perhaps the most formidable naval strike force ever assembled in the history of warfare. Mitcher commanded 15 aircraft carriers, and from their decks he could launch nearly 900 aircraft, giving him almost double the air power that Ozawa could muster. Protecting these carriers was a screen of 7 fast battleships, their advanced designs allowing them to keep pace with the carriers while providing devastating anti-aircraft fire. 21 cruisers added their own guns to the defensive umbrella, while nearly 60 destroyers prowled the perimeter, watching for submarines and ready to intercept any surface threat. The sheer scale of American industrial might was on full display in this armada. Both the Japanese and American commanders understood with perfect clarity what was at stake in the coming engagement. This would not be just another battle for control of some scattered islands in the vastness of the Pacific. The outcome would determine whether the Marianas fell, which in turn would determine whether Japan's cities would burn under American bombs, which in turn would determine how much longer the war itself could continue. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered by those who lived through it and studied it afterward as the largest carrier battle that had ever been fought, an engagement that would acquire a darkly humorous name that nevertheless captured its one-sided nature with brutal accuracy. The early morning hours of June 19, 1944, found Vice Admiral Ozawa standing on the flag bridge of the Taiho, his flagship and one of the newest and most advanced carriers in the Japanese fleet. His eyes swept across the horizon repeatedly as the sky began to lighten, certain in his mind that somewhere out there to the east, hidden beyond the curve of the earth, the American fleet was waiting. At 45 minutes past 4 in the morning, he gave the order for the first reconnaissance aircraft to be launched, wanting to locate the enemy before committing his strike forces. The Americans had the same idea, and their own scout planes were taking off from carrier decks at almost the exact same moment. Less than an hour later, at 50 minutes past 5, one of the Japanese Zero fighters spotted the American fleet spread out below. The pilot immediately began transmitting the coordinates back to his command, knowing this information was vital. Having completed that mission, and perhaps caught up in the adrenaline of the moment, he then pushed his stick forward and dove toward one of the American destroyers visible below, his guns chattering as he attempted to strafe the ship. The destroyer's anti-aircraft batteries responded instantly, filling the air around the diving Zero with explosive shells and tracer rounds. The Japanese pilot never pulled out of his dive, his plane disintegrating under the concentrated fire and crashing into the sea. It was an insignificant action in itself, one pilot and one plane among thousands, but it marked the official beginning of the battle that both sides had been maneuvering toward for days. The American radar operators had detected the approaching Japanese reconnaissance planes, and warning signals went out across the fleet. On Guam, Japanese squadrons that had been stationed there for precisely this kind of situation scrambled to prepare their aircraft for launch, ground crews working frantically to arm and fuel the planes. But American radar was watching them too, the electronic eyes that gave the United States such an advantage in this war picking up the activity. Alarm bells sounded throughout the American carriers, and from the deck of the USS Belleau Wood, a formation of F-6F Hellcat fighters roared into the sky, their powerful engines pulling them rapidly up to altitude as they raced to intercept the Japanese planes before they could organize their attack. At the airfield on Rota, Japanese aircraft were still in the vulnerable process of taking off, some accelerating down the runway while others had just lifted their wheels off the ground when the American Hellcats came screaming in from above. What followed was less a battle than a slaughter. The engagement lasted less than 60 minutes from first contact to final kill, and in that brief span of time, 35 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, either shot down in flames or blown apart on the ground. The Americans lost exactly one Hellcat. Those Japanese pilots who survived the onslaught had no choice but to abandon any thought of attacking the American fleet and instead flee back to whatever safety they could find. With the threat from the land-based aircraft temporarily neutralized, the American fleet could now turn its full attention to dealing with Ozawa's carriers. Aboard the flagship USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher stood calmly watching the radar displays, his experienced eye interpreting the glowing blips that represented aircraft and ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. At 30 minutes past 8 that morning, the radar screens suddenly lit up with a massive contact, hundreds of aircraft approaching from the direction of the Japanese fleet. Ozawa had launched his strikes, and they were on their way. The Japanese had divided their attack into 3 separate waves to maximize their chances of overwhelming the American defenses. The first wave, designated Force C, consisted of 69 aircraft. The second wave from Force A was much larger, with 128 planes. The third wave from Force B included 47 aircraft. In less than a single hour, the Japanese had managed to launch a total of 244 aircraft, every one of them aimed at the American fleet with orders to sink as many carriers as possible. By 10 o'clock in the morning, American radar operators detected the leading edge of this massive strike at a distance of 240 kilometers, still far enough away that there was time to prepare, but close enough that the battle would be joined very soon. Mitcher wasted no time issuing orders. Every available Hellcat fighter was to be launched immediately to intercept the incoming raid. He also recalled the patrol aircraft that had been orbiting near Guam, wanting every fighter he could muster in position to meet the Japanese attack. Flying in the lead section of one of the Japanese formations, a pilot named Masatoshi Nakagawa concentrated on maintaining position while scanning the horizon ahead for any sign of the American carriers that were supposed to be somewhere in front of them. When the formation had closed to within approximately 100 kilometers of where intelligence had placed the enemy fleet, someone made the decision to pause and regroup, wanting to make sure all the aircraft were properly organized before making their final approach. It seemed like a reasonable tactical decision at the time, but it would prove to be a fatal mistake. At 36 minutes past 10 in the morning, while the Japanese planes were milling about trying to sort themselves into proper attack formation, American Hellcats dove out of the sun and tore into them with devastating effect. The sky became a chaotic swirl of turning, diving, climbing aircraft, punctuated by the staccato hammering of machine guns and the bright flashes of exploding planes. Within just a few minutes of that initial contact, 25 Japanese aircraft had been blown out of the sky, spinning down in flames or breaking apart in mid-air. The Americans lost one Hellcat. Before the Japanese could recover from that first shock, another 16 of their planes were shot down. Many of the surviving pilots, realizing they had no chance of fighting through to the American carriers, made the desperate decision to jettison their bombs into the ocean below, hoping the reduced weight would let them escape faster. A handful of aircraft did manage to break through the fighter screen, only to find themselves confronted with something even more terrifying than enemy fighters. The American fleet had spent years perfecting its anti-aircraft defenses, and now those preparations paid off. Hundreds of 5-inch guns and 40mm cannons opened fire simultaneously, creating a wall of steel and high explosive that no aircraft could hope to penetrate. The Americans had also developed proximity-fused shells, a technological advancement that the Japanese had no answer for. These shells would explode automatically when they detected an aircraft nearby, filling the air with deadly fragments that could shred a plane even without a direct hit. The result was a kill zone so dense that Japanese pilots described it later as flying into a solid wall. One bomb did manage to find its target, slamming into the deck of the battleship USS South Dakota with enormous force. The ship shuddered under the impact, and the explosion killed or wounded more than 50 of her crew. But South Dakota had been built to take such punishment, her heavy armor preventing the bomb from penetrating to the vital spaces below. Damage control parties rushed to contain the fires, and within a remarkably short time, the battleship was back in formation and ready to continue fighting. Not a single Japanese aircraft succeeded in reaching the American carriers, the primary targets of the entire attack. By the time the first wave had been completely dealt with, the butcher's bill was clear. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft that had set out with such high hopes, 42 had been destroyed, and only 27 managed to limp back to their carriers. The engagement paused briefly as both sides caught their breath, but everyone involved knew this was merely the interval between rounds, not the end of the fight. The entire Battle of the Philippine Sea was really only just beginning. Aboard the carrier Zuikaku, one of the veterans that had survived from Pearl Harbor all the way through to this point in the war, Japanese deck crews worked with frantic urgency to prepare another strike. Ozawa, still convinced that he could achieve the decisive victory that had been promised, made the decision to commit the remainder of his available aircraft from the main carrier force. At 9 o'clock in the morning, even as the first wave was still approaching the American fleet, he gave the order to launch the second wave, this time with 129 aircraft, hoping that greater numbers would succeed where the first attack had failed. As midday approached at 7 minutes past 11, the American radar screens once again showed a large mass of incoming aircraft, this time approaching from the southwest. The Hellcat pilots, who had just finished decimating the first wave, were already back at altitude and waiting for them. At a distance of 60 miles from the American fleet, which translated to 97 kilometers, the Japanese formation ran straight into the waiting American fighters. The Japanese pilots never even got close enough to see the enemy ships with their own eyes before Hellcats came screaming down on them from multiple directions at once. The slaughter was even worse than what the first wave had endured. Within minutes of the first contact, approximately 70 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, their flaming wreckage scattered across miles of ocean. A relatively small number did manage to break through the fighter screen, and these survivors split into several groups to try to carry out scattered attacks against whatever targets they could find. 6 dive bombers identified Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery's carrier group and rolled into their attacks, pushing over into their dives and releasing their bombs toward the USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill. The bombs landed close aboard both carriers, close enough that the explosions started some fires and caused casualties among exposed personnel, but fortunately for the Americans, none of the bombs scored direct hits on the flight decks or vital areas. Damage control teams managed to contain the fires relatively quickly, and the damage, while painful, was minor enough that neither carrier was seriously impaired. Another group of Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers made their approach toward the USS Enterprise, which had been a prime target for Japanese forces since the early days of the war. Multiple torpedoes were launched, their wakes visible in the water as they ran toward the carrier. But every single one missed, Enterprise's captain having maneuvered his ship skillfully enough to avoid them all. 3 more torpedo bombers attempted to line up an attack run on the USS Princeton, but they never completed it. Anti-aircraft fire from the carrier and her escorts blew all 3 aircraft apart as soon as they came within range, their bombs and torpedoes detonating in spectacular explosions that sent shockwave ripples across the water. By the time the second wave had been completely repulsed, the losses were staggering even by the brutal standards that had been set earlier that morning. 97 of the 129 Japanese aircraft that had set out never made it back to their carriers. Their pilots and aircrew were dead, their planes destroyed, and they had accomplished virtually nothing. The sun climbed higher in the sky until it stood nearly overhead, its light reflecting off oil slicks that marked where aircraft had crashed into the sea. The Philippine Sea looked deceptively peaceful from a distance, though anyone looking closely would have seen the debris and the occasional life raft or floating body. Despite the catastrophic losses his air groups had already suffered, Ozawa refused to give up. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he ordered a third strike launched from his northern carrier group, this time with 47 aircraft. The plan was to hit the American fleet from a different angle, hoping to catch them off guard or at least divide their fighter coverage. But 80 kilometers from the American ships, still well out of visual range, the Japanese formation ran into a wall of 40 Hellcats that had been positioned precisely to intercept them. The Japanese pilots were taken completely by surprise, the formation scattering in all directions as the Americans tore into them. 7 aircraft were shot down in the initial clash, which was actually far fewer losses than the earlier waves had suffered. But the survivors, seeing what had happened to their comrades and knowing what had befallen the previous strikes, made the collective decision to abandon the mission entirely. They jettisoned their bombs into the ocean and turned for home. The 40 aircraft that managed to return representing a rare piece of good fortune for Ozawa on a day when fortune had abandoned him almost completely. Still unwilling to accept that the battle was lost, Ozawa committed his final reserves in one last desperate gamble. Between 11 o'clock and 11:30 in the morning, his carriers launched a fourth and final strike wave, consisting of 84 aircraft, every plane and every trained pilot he had left. But fate, which had already been cruel to the Japanese that day, had one more twist prepared. The intelligence information that had been provided to the Japanese pilots contained a critical error in the coordinates for the American fleet's position. The strike force searched fruitlessly across empty ocean as their fuel gauges steadily dropped toward empty. Unable to locate their targets and unable to make it back to their carriers without refueling, the formation commanders made the difficult decision to split the group. One portion would proceed to Guam, while the other headed for Rota, where they could refuel before making another attempt, or at least make it back to their carriers. The withdrawal turned into another disaster. The group that headed toward Rota, either through bad navigation or bad luck, flew directly into the area where Rear Admiral Montgomery's task force was operating. The American Combat Air Patrol spotted them immediately and rose to intercept. 18 Japanese planes found themselves engaged in a running battle with Hellcats. Half of them managed to escape, but 9 were shot down, adding to the day's mounting toll. Meanwhile, 9 Japanese dive bombers that had somehow avoided the Hellcats made one last desperate attempt to hit the USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill, the same carriers that had been targeted earlier. Their bombs landed close alongside both ships, the explosions sending geysers of water high enough to cascade down onto the flight decks, but once again there were no direct hits and no significant damage. American anti-aircraft fire destroyed 8 of the 9 attackers, with only a single plane managing to escape. The situation at Guam was, if anything, even worse than what had happened near Rota. As the remaining Japanese aircraft from the 4th wave approached the island to land and refuel, they had no idea that American carriers had launched their own strike against the airfield. 27 Hellcats from various carriers swept in just as the Japanese planes were in their landing patterns, the most vulnerable moment for any aircraft. With no time to accelerate, climb, or maneuver, the Japanese pilots were completely helpless as the Hellcats tore through them. Some were shot down as they approached the runway, others were caught just after touchdown while still rolling out, and still others were destroyed while trying to take off again in a desperate attempt to fight back. In just a few minutes of one-sided combat, 30 more aircraft were destroyed. Many of the planes that did survive the attack were so badly shot up that they could never be made combat-ready again. By the afternoon of June 19, 1944, as the smoke gradually began to clear and the sounds of combat faded away, the true scale of the disaster that had befallen Japan became apparent. In the span of a single day of fighting, the Japanese had suffered losses that were unprecedented, even in a war that had already seen so much destruction. Approximately 330 aircraft had been destroyed, a figure that included not only the carrier air groups under Ozawa's direct command, but also most of the land-based planes that had been stationed in the Marianas to support the operation. Nearly half of the carrier air groups that Ozawa had started the day with were simply gone, their pilots dead and their aircraft shattered wreckage on the ocean floor. The contrast with American losses was stark and shocking. Only 23 American planes had been lost during the entire day's fighting. The fleet itself remained virtually untouched, except for the casualties aboard the battleship South Dakota and some minor damage to a few other vessels, none of which seriously impaired their combat capability. Watching this massacre unfold, one American pilot reportedly remarked that shooting down the Japanese planes was like an old-fashioned turkey shoot, the kind of event where people would gather to see who could shoot the most birds. From that moment forward, the engagement acquired the nickname that would follow it through history. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot perfectly captured the one-sided nature of the battle, though for the Japanese pilots who died that day, there was nothing sporting about it at all. In the span of just one day, the elite of Japan's naval aviation had been effectively wiped out, years of training and irreplaceable combat experience lost forever. Yet despite the magnitude of the catastrophe, Japan's suffering was not yet over. As darkness fell across the Philippine Sea, those looking toward the horizon could still see towering columns of flame burning in the distance, marking the death throes of 2 Japanese aircraft carriers. While the fierce air battles had been raging in the skies above, American submarines had been stalking beneath the waves, and they had struck with devastating effectiveness. Early that same morning, the USS Albacore had detected Ozawa's flagship Taiho through her periscope and had maneuvered into an ideal attack position. At 15 minutes past 8 in the morning, just as Taiho was in the middle of launching aircraft for what would become the second strike wave, Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes toward the massive carrier. Lookouts aboard Taiho spotted the white wakes cutting through the water and immediately began shouting warnings. The carrier's captain ordered a hard turn to port while the escorting destroyers began dropping depth charges in an attempt to destroy or at least distract the submarine. In the chaos and confusion of those moments, a Japanese pilot named Sakio Komatsu had just taken off from Taiho's flight deck when he spotted one of the torpedoes running directly toward his ship. Making a split-second decision that would cost him his life, he deliberately flew his aircraft directly into the torpedo's path. The explosion destroyed his plane instantly, killing him, but it also detonated the torpedo short of the carrier. Taiho managed to avoid one potentially fatal hit through this act of sacrifice, but her luck ran out immediately afterward when another torpedo from the same spread slammed into her starboard side. The explosion tore a massive gash in the hull below the waterline, and seawater began flooding into the compartments. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel tanks, allowing volatile gasoline to spill into the damaged areas. The ship staggered under the impact and took on a noticeable list, but thanks to her advanced damage control systems and relatively new construction, Taiho managed to keep steaming under her own power for several more hours. Her crew worked frantically to shore up bulkheads and contain the flooding, and for a while it seemed like they might be able to save her. By midday, tragedy struck the Japanese fleet again, this time targeting a different carrier with a much longer and more distinguished combat record. The USS Kavala had been shadowing the veteran carrier Shokaku, which had survived Pearl Harbor and had fought in virtually every major carrier battle since then. At 23 minutes past 11 in the morning, while Shokaku was busy recovering aircraft from one of the strikes and simultaneously refueling planes on her hangar deck, Kavala fired her own spread of torpedoes. At least 3 of them struck home, the explosions tearing open the carrier's hull and setting off secondary explosions inside. Fuel and ordnance that had been stored in the hangar for the rearming operations ignited, creating a massive fireball that engulfed the forward part of the ship. The heat was so intense that paint blistered and metal began to warp. Seeing that the fires were spreading too rapidly to be controlled, the captain gave the order to abandon ship, the most difficult command any captain ever has to give. At 8 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, a final catastrophic explosion, far larger than any of the previous ones, literally tore the carrier apart. Shokaku broke into 2 pieces and sank rapidly, taking 1,263 sailors and airmen down with her. Destroyers that had been escorting the carrier managed to rescue about 570 survivors from the water, including Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, but more than twice that number were lost. Meanwhile, back aboard the stricken Taiho, her crew had been working desperately throughout the afternoon to save their ship. They sealed bulkheads, flooded compartments with carbon dioxide to suppress fires, and did everything they had been trained to do. For several hours, their efforts seemed to be working, and there was real hope that the flagship might make it back to port for repairs. But a single mistake, born of inexperience and made with the best of intentions, sealed the carrier's fate. A damage control officer, trying to clear the dangerous gasoline fumes that had built up throughout the ship from the ruptured fuel tanks, ordered the ventilation system run at maximum power. His reasoning was sound in theory, wanting to blow the volatile vapors out of the ship before they could cause further problems. But instead of venting the fumes safely overboard, the ventilation system simply distributed them more evenly throughout the entire vessel, creating a floating bomb waiting for a spark. At 32 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, that spark came from a generator somewhere deep in the ship's machinery spaces. The resulting explosion was catastrophic beyond description, a chain reaction of internal detonations that ripped through the vessel from stem to stern. Elevator platforms were blown completely off the ship, shooting hundreds of feet into the air. Deck plates were torn open like tissue paper. Flames erupted from every opening, climbing hundreds of meters into the sky and visible for many miles in all directions. The pride of the Japanese fleet, one of their newest and most advanced carriers, shook violently under the force of the explosions and then began to settle into the water. Admiral Ozawa barely managed to escape with his life, transferring his flag to a destroyer that came alongside just in time. The Taiho went down with 1,650 of her crew still trapped aboard. In the space of a single day, Japan had lost 2 of its most important and capable aircraft carriers, not to air attack or surface combat, but to submarine torpedoes, a threat that the Imperial Navy had consistently underestimated throughout the war. As dawn broke on June 20th, after a night during which the remnants of Ozawa's shattered force attempted to regroup and recover, the surviving Japanese ships were steaming westward at maximum speed, hoping to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the American fleet. But the Americans had no intention of letting them escape. Admiral Spruance ordered his entire fleet to pursue at full speed through the night, accepting the risks of high-speed steaming in darkness in exchange for the chance to finish off the crippled Japanese force. By morning, dozens of American scout planes were sweeping across vast expanses of ocean, searching for any sign of the retreating enemy. On the carrier Zuikaku, the only one of the carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor still afloat and still in commission, Ozawa transferred his flag at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Taiho having gone down the previous day. It was at this point that he finally learned the full extent of the disaster that had befallen his forces on June 19th. All 4 of the massive strike waves he had launched had been virtually annihilated, achieving almost nothing in return for their terrible losses. His carrier air groups, which had started the battle with hundreds of aircraft, were now reduced to roughly 150 operational planes, and many of those were damaged or low on fuel. What Ozawa did not know, because his subordinates had been too afraid to tell him the full truth, was that the land-based aircraft from Guam and Rota, the planes he had been counting on to supplement his carrier forces, had also been almost completely destroyed. Operating in ignorance of just how desperate his situation truly was, Ozawa actually still clung to the idea that he might be able to mount another major strike on June 21st, somehow turning the battle around despite everything that had already happened. By midday on June 20th, the skies were clear and the visibility was excellent, perfect conditions for reconnaissance aircraft, but American scout planes had still not managed to locate the Japanese fleet. All through the morning and into the early afternoon hours, Mitscher grew increasingly restless and frustrated as report after report came back with the same disappointing message: no contact with the enemy. Finally, at 40 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, a scout plane from the USS Enterprise caught sight of the Japanese fleet on the distant horizon and immediately radioed back a brief contact report. Mitscher demanded precise coordinates, needing to know exactly where the enemy was before he could launch a strike. At 5 minutes past 4, the confirmation arrived with the detailed information he needed. The Japanese fleet was 275 miles to the west and was making 20 knots on a generally westerly heading. Time was now working against the Americans in a different way. The sun would set around 6:30 in the evening, leaving less than 2 hours of daylight remaining. A strike launched now would be flying at the very extreme edge of the aircraft's combat radius, and there was virtually no chance that the planes would be able to make it back before darkness fell. Landing on a carrier deck at night was extraordinarily dangerous, even in the best of circumstances, and these pilots would be doing it after an exhausting combat mission at maximum range. Mitscher faced a decision that would define his career. He could play it safe, hold his aircraft back, and try again the next day when conditions would be better. But there was no guarantee that the Japanese fleet would still be within range tomorrow, and this might be the only chance to deliver a knockout blow. After a moment of consideration, he gave the order that would send his air crews into harm's way, but might win the battle decisively. Launch all aircraft. It was an enormous gamble, as everyone involved understood perfectly well. The strike would be operating at the absolute limit of the plane's range, and almost all of them would certainly have to land after dark, something that would inevitably lead to crashes and losses. But Mitscher and his commanders recognized that this was potentially the decisive moment of the entire battle. If they could destroy what remained of Ozawa's carriers now, the Japanese would never again be able to threaten American naval supremacy in the Pacific. The decision made, the fleet burst into coordinated action. The decks of the American carriers shook with the thunder of engines as nearly every operational aircraft in Task Force 58 was launched in the largest single strike of the entire battle. 226 planes climbed into the late afternoon sky, an armada that represented almost the entire striking power of the American fleet. The composition of the strike showed how seriously the Americans were taking this opportunity. 95 Hellcat fighters, each one carrying a 500-pound bomb in addition to their normal guns and ammunition. 54 Avenger torpedo bombers, their bellies heavy with torpedoes. 77 dive bombers, a mix of Helldiver and Dauntless aircraft, each one loaded with armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate carrier flight decks. Wave after wave climbed to altitude and then headed west, racing against the setting sun in pursuit of Ozawa's battered and retreating force. At approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, while the Japanese fleet was in the middle of refueling operations, with tankers alongside the carriers and fuel hoses connected, lookouts suddenly began pointing toward the eastern horizon and shouting warnings. Dark shapes were approaching, growing larger by the second. Air raid sirens began their distinctive wail across every ship in the formation. Ozawa, still determined to fight despite everything that had happened, scrambled his last available fighters into the air, approximately 35 Zeros that represented virtually the last of his air defense capability. The escorting warships tightened their formation around the precious carriers, their anti-aircraft crews loading their guns and training them toward the approaching threat. Within minutes, the roar of American engines filled the sky, growing louder and louder until it drowned out almost every other sound. Then the assault began. The first American squadron to make contact happened to stumble across 3 Japanese oilers that were trailing behind the main fleet, having fallen back during the refueling operations. These tankers represented a critical asset for the Japanese, as without fuel the fleet couldn't maneuver or escape. Some of the American groups, seeing these valuable targets and knowing their own fuel was running low, made the tactical decision to strike immediately rather than pressing on to search for the carriers. Bombs tore into the vulnerable tankers, which were loaded with thousands of gallons of highly flammable fuel oil. 2 of the tankers burst into flames almost immediately, the fires spreading so rapidly that the crews had no chance to fight them. The 3rd tanker was broken in half by a near miss that detonated so close to her hull that the shockwave split the ship's keel. Columns of fire and smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible for many miles in all directions, and Ozawa could only stand on his flag bridge and watch in impotent fury as his precious and irreplaceable supply ships were destroyed. But the oilers were only a sideshow. The main weight of the American strike was aimed squarely at the carriers, and now that full force fell on them with devastating effect. On the carrier Hiyo, officers on the bridge barely had time to shout a warning about enemy aircraft approaching from the port side before torpedoes were slamming into the hull below the waterline. Avenger torpedo bombers from the USS Belleau Wood had slipped through the defensive screen and had executed a textbook attack. At least 2 torpedoes hit, possibly more, the explosions blowing enormous holes in the carrier's side and allowing the sea to pour in. Hiyo shuddered violently under the impacts, her deck heaving and buckling, and smoke immediately began engulfing the flight deck and superstructure. The fires spread too quickly for the damage control parties to contain them, fed by ruptured fuel lines and exploding ammunition. Within 2 hours of the initial attack, a massive explosion, far larger than the torpedo hits had been, ripped the carrier apart from the inside. Hiyo broke into 2 distinct pieces and sank rapidly, taking 250 of her crew down with her. Destroyers managed to rescue more than 1,000 survivors from the water, but the carrier herself was gone forever. Elsewhere in the formation, the carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda all came under attack. Thick black smoke rose from their decks as bombs exploded and fires broke out. Most of the bombs that were aimed at these ships actually detonated close alongside, rather than scoring direct hits on the targets themselves, the spray from the near misses drenching the flight decks but sparing the carriers from total destruction. The damage was significant enough to reduce their combat effectiveness, but quick action by their crews prevented any of them from sinking. The battleship Haruna was struck on one of her main gun turrets, the impact killing and wounding many of the crew who had been manning the guns. But the Japanese gunnery officer, showing great presence of mind under pressure, immediately ordered the magazines below the damaged turret flooded with seawater, preventing what could have been a catastrophic detonation if the fire had reached the stored powder and shells. After approximately 30 minutes of relentless bombardment, the American strike began to withdraw, their bombs and torpedoes expended and their fuel running dangerously low. Japan had paid a heavy price for this attack. 3 vital fleet oilers had been sunk, eliminating the Japanese fleet's ability to refuel at sea. The carrier Hiyo was gone, and the other carriers, while still afloat, were damaged and burning. American losses in the attack itself were relatively light, about 20 planes shot down by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Ozawa stood on the bridge of Zuikaku, which was now his flagship after losing 2 previous flagships in 2 days, and watched black smoke billow across what remained of his fleet. The dream of a decisive battle that would turn the tide of the war had completely collapsed. The Imperial Navy's last throw of the dice had failed utterly. For the American air crews, the mission was far from finished, even though the attack itself was over. Now came the most dangerous part of the entire operation, the long flight back to their carriers in gathering darkness after having flown nearly 300 miles to reach the target. At 8:45 in the evening, the first wave of returning aircraft appeared in the darkening sky, their navigation lights blinking as they searched desperately for their carriers. Landing on a carrier deck at night after such a long and exhausting combat mission was nearly impossible under any circumstances. The pilots were exhausted, low on fuel, and in many cases disoriented. On the USS Hornet, Rear Admiral Joseph Clark made the bold decision to order the carrier's floodlights switched on to guide the pilots home, even though this would make the ship visible to any Japanese submarines that might be lurking in the area. Mitcher, watching the situation develop, made an even more dramatic choice. He ordered the entire fleet illuminated, exposing them all to risk but giving his pilots at least a fighting chance to find their way home. Searchlights swept back and forth across the sky, their powerful beams cutting through the darkness. Destroyers began firing star shells and flares to light up the ocean surface, marking the fleet's position and helping pilots who might otherwise have had to ditch in the dark water. One by one, exhausted aircraft came down toward the flight decks, some landing successfully while others crashed on approach or missed the arresting wires and skidded into the barriers. Some pilots, their fuel tanks running completely dry, crash-landed on the first carrier deck they could find, regardless of whether it was their own ship or not. Others, unable to reach the carriers at all, were forced to ditch in the ocean or to bail out, trusting that the rescue operations would find them. Those rescue operations continued throughout the entire night, with destroyers and smaller craft searching the dark water for survivors. By the time dawn broke on June 21st, the final accounting could be made. 80 aircraft had been lost, either to crashes during the night recovery operations or because they had simply run out of fuel and gone into the ocean. But remarkably, about 3/4 of the air crew survived, many of them plucked from the water by rescue vessels that had worked tirelessly through the hours of darkness. Mitcher stood on his flag bridge as the sun rose, fully aware of what his decision had cost. 80 aircraft represented a significant loss, though far less than what it could have been. But he had accepted that cost in exchange for the chance to destroy the Japanese carrier force, and in that he had succeeded. It was the price of his sunset gamble, and he had been willing to pay it. That same night, thousands of miles away at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Toyota sat reading the final reports that had been transmitted from Ozawa's retreating fleet. The outcome of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was now undeniable and unambiguous. The battle had ended in complete disaster for Japan. He transmitted the order for Ozawa to withdraw, though by that point the decision to retreat had already been made out of pure necessity. The American fleet pursued briefly on June 21st, but Spruance, having achieved his primary objectives of protecting the Saipan landings and destroying Japanese carrier Airpower, chose not to risk his fleet in an extended chase across the Pacific. He ordered his forces to break off the pursuit and return to support the ground operations in the Marianas. After 2 full days of intense combat, the Philippine Sea had been the stage for the largest carrier battle in the entire history of naval warfare, and the results were utterly one-sided. Japan had launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 major strike waves throughout June 19th. Only 130 of those planes made it back to their carriers, and many of those were later lost when their carriers were sunk or damaged beyond repair. Including the land-based aircraft from Guam and Rota and the losses from submarine attacks, Japan's total casualties for the battle were somewhere between 475 and 550 aircraft, virtually eliminating the entire elite carrier air arm that had taken years to build and train. Ozawa's once formidable carrier force had been reduced to barely 35 operational aircraft, not even enough to provide proper air defense for a single carrier, let alone 9 of them. The losses in ships were equally devastating to Japan's hopes. 3 fleet carriers had been sunk, the Taiho, Shokaku and Hio, representing an enormous amount of industrial capacity and naval power that Japan had no hope of replacing. 2 fleet oilers had also been destroyed, crippling the fleet's ability to operate far from friendly ports. The surviving carriers had all sustained damage of varying degrees of severity, and even when they were repaired, there would be no air groups to fly from their decks. The Americans, by stark contrast, had suffered almost negligible losses. Not a single ship had been sunk during the entire 2-day battle. The battleship South Dakota had taken some damage from that one bomb hit, but she remained fully operational and would be back to 100% effectiveness after minor repairs. A handful of other ships had sustained light damage from near misses and fragments, but nothing that seriously impaired their fighting capability. The total American aircraft losses for the entire battle amounted to approximately 123 planes, and many of those had been lost to operational accidents during the night recovery rather than to enemy action. Of those aircraft that were lost to enemy action, the majority of the crews had been rescued and would fly again. The disparity in losses was so extreme that it seemed almost impossible, yet the numbers were accurate. The United States had won perhaps the most one-sided major naval victory in history. After this crushing defeat, Japan would never again be able to assemble a carrier force strong enough or skilled enough to challenge American naval supremacy in open battle. The long years of training that had gone into creating the elite carrier pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific in the early years of the war were simply gone, those pilots dead and no adequate replacements available. 4 months later, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, which would be the largest naval battle of the entire Second World War, Ozawa still nominally commanded what remained of Japan's carrier force. But his carriers had virtually no aircraft left to fly from their decks, and the few pilots who were available were inadequately trained and inexperienced. The carriers sailed north as nothing more than decoys, a desperate and ultimately tragic ruse designed to lure the American fleet away from the real fighting, sacrificing themselves so that Japanese surface forces might have a chance to attack the invasion fleet. It was a fitting and melancholy end for what had once been the most powerful carrier fleet in the world. From a strategic perspective, the American victory at the Philippine Sea had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate destruction of ships and aircraft. The success of the battle opened the door for Allied forces to seize the Mariana Islands without significant interference from Japanese naval forces. Soon after the battle, Saipan fell to American ground forces after weeks of brutal fighting. The loss of Saipan tore a fatal breach in what Japan had grandly called its absolute defense line, the perimeter that was supposed to protect the homeland from invasion. The strategic consequences of losing Saipan became apparent almost immediately. American engineers rapidly constructed massive airfields on the island, specifically designed to accommodate the enormous B-29 Superfortress bombers that had been developed for just this purpose. From the runways on Saipan and the other Mariana Islands that fell shortly afterward, American bombers began launching devastating strategic bombing raids against the Japanese homeland. City after city was subjected to incendiary attacks that created firestorms, reducing vast urban areas to burned-out ruins and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The destruction wrought by these bombing campaigns was immense, far exceeding anything that the relatively limited carrier raids earlier in the war had been able to achieve. Japan's industrial capacity was systematically destroyed, its ability to produce war material steadily eroded, and its civilian population subjected to horrors that made continued resistance increasingly difficult to justify. In every meaningful sense, both tactical and strategic, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought across 2 days in June of 1944, represented the final confirmation of American absolute naval supremacy in the Pacific theater. It marked the point of no return for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the moment when any realistic hope of victory, or even of a negotiated peace that would preserve some of Japan's conquests, vanished forever. The battle heralded the inevitable and irreversible decline of Japanese naval power in the Second World War, a decline that would continue without interruption until the final surrender in August of 1945 brought the entire conflict to its conclusion. The Turkey Shoot, as it came to be called, had accomplished exactly what Mitchell and Spruance had hoped for, the destruction of Japan's ability to fight back at sea, opening the way for the final advance toward the Japanese home islands themselves.